So in this video, let's continue to explore this path of distinguishing and experiencing the differences between consciousness and thinking, and how so much of modern Western culture is so asleep in the dream of thinking that we've even invented a term. We call it the unconscious. And so when we're not thinking, many of us will use the expression, well, they were unconscious. And what I want to show is, I ended the last video with a metaphor about consciousness, and I said gold is a metaphor for consciousness because gold has been around forever. It will be around forever. It just manifests in different ways. It plays different forms, so it may become a ring temporarily, but the ring is just a temporary manifestation of the gold, and it may become a piece of jewelry or a watch case, and it can change and go through all these different, it's almost like theater, playing these different forms, but there's no way to destroy the gold itself. And in this same way, each of the forms are a type of illusion, because in Maya, the technical definition is for something to not be what it appears to be. And so when the gold is playing a ring, it's giving this impression that it isn't what it is. And of course, that's the ultimate game of consciousness. But for this video, I want to use a book by Harris. And it's a great book. I'm going to be a little critical of it, but that's okay. It doesn't mean that the book isn't valuable. It's an incredibly valuable book because it shows how modern culture, modern consciousness researchers confuse thinking and consciousness because they are trying to think about consciousness. And we can see this even in the title. And so the title is Conscious, A Brief Guide to the Fundamental Mystery of the Mind. And so the mind isn't really a mystery. In fact, we've got it pretty well figured out. That's what I do in my books. I take the findings over the last 100 years of mind and show that this isn't who you are. And in the West, particularly in psychology, they assume that when the mind ends, we end. We are nothing but mind. And what I try to show in these books is that the mind is actually not where we end. As soon as the mind ends, then we begin. But we still have to figure out mind. And I could do a short video of, because most of the stuff I describe in the books is from introduction textbooks and introduction to cognitive psychology textbooks. It's the basic findings of the mind. But the point is always know the mind and then know that it's not who you are. So we see that mistake here. We're confusing the thinking mind with consciousness because when the thinking mind ends, that's when we really get to start the exploration of consciousness. Let's start off with a definition. Now, this is a definition from Nagel. And so, Harris begins the book in any way you would start a book. You have to try to define it. The topic, in this case, is consciousness. But of course, this is always tricky. And part of the video is about why this is so tricky, because they're making that mistake of confusing the ring for the gold itself. So he wrote this, Nagel wrote this in a paper called What's It Like to Be a Bat? Because there's something that it's like to be a bat, flying around in a cave using echolocation, bouncing sounds off the cave walls so you can navigate your way through the cave. I can't really imagine that, but there is something that it's like for that bat to have that experience. So here's the definition. I'll show you why it's 90% on track, and then the 10% where it loses, where it makes the mistake of confusing consciousness with thinking. So an organism is conscious if there is something that it is like to be that organism. So there's no doubt that consciousness manifests in different ways. There's something that it is like for you to be watching this in your meat suit, and there's something it's like for me to be talking here in my meat suit, and there's something that's like to have your coffee in the morning, and there's something that's like for a bat to fly around in a cave. But that is to confuse the ring for the gold. It's to confuse the particular manifestations of consciousness with what underlies it. And we're not the form or the particular contents of consciousness. We are consciousness temporarily playing that form for a very temporary amount of time. And in the East, because they have this recognition that where mind ends, that's where our true self begins. They recognize that consciousness is never turned off. For us, we call it the unconscious. So we think, when I go to sleep, outside of dreaming, which maybe we would say is a unique state of consciousness, we'd say the consciousness switch is off. And I'm asleep, which is to say unconscious most of the night. In the East, in the teachings of the Upanishads and other teachings where they have a deep recognition for the differences between thinking and consciousness, it's taught and experienced that consciousness is never off. So even during sleep, even during anesthesia, consciousness is ever present, which is to say, no matter what shape, even if it's formless and the mind is so quiet, there's no contents to consciousness, there's no particular contents to consciousness still is present. And sometimes the expression is consciousness being conscious of itself. But again, we have this completely radically different version here in the West where some forms of matter mysteriously turn into consciousness. It's like we have it reversed, thinking that somehow the ring creates the gold. And there's another quote here by Rebecca Goldstein, and she's a philosopher, and puts it so eloquently, just perfectly nails how we think as Westerners and how we confuse the ring and the gold, which is to say how we confuse thinking and consciousness. So here's the quote. Sure, consciousness is a matter of matter. What else could it be, since that's all we are? Okay. But still, the fact that some hunks of matter have an inner life is unlike any other properties of matter we have yet encountered, much less accounted for. So in other words, for some reason, this 3 pounds of gelatinous goo in my skull mysteriously becomes conscious, but this book is doomed to being unconscious. Okay, the last part of the quote is really the best part, in my opinion. Suddenly, matter wakes up and takes in the world, as if there's somehow consciousness up here in the skull, and it is conscious of the world that's physically out there, independent of it. And, consciousness is new. Consciousness just showed up on the scene just recently. And all that is to say is how we've got it all confused. And again, the confusion is not a judgment. If we are confused, it's because that's another mysterious, magnificent manifestation of consciousness. Consciousness becoming a thought that it is what it isn't. And that is a game that could only be played by consciousness pretending to be what it isn't by deeply falling asleep in the dream of thinking.